Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I would like to welcome you to episode 182 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions. Advanced Compliance Solutions has recently announced two very exciting service offerings. The first one is FCPA Masterclass training that I'll be putting on. The first dates are September 10th and 11th in Houston. The second is the Compliance Retreat, where I can come to your corporation and sit down and spend a day with you focusing on your compliance program. If you need some more information on either of these, please give me a shout at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Today I'm privileged to have Kate Atkinson. Kate is a partner at Miller & Chevalier in Washington, D.C., and she talks to us about the firm's quarterly FCPA report, which is the 2015 Summer FCPA report. And in it, we talk about the Siegelman case, the SEC enforcement action against BHP Billiton and what it portend, some of the general trends that the firm sees in the first half of the year, and we conclude with a short discussion of where the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom is going with the bribery act. The episode comes in at just under 24 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. Episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today you're in for a real treat because I have with me Kate Atkinson. Kate's a partner at Miller & Chevalier in Washington, and she's going to talk to us about the well-known report the firm puts out. They put out a quarterly FCPA review as well as an annual review, but today we're going to visit about some of her thoughts on what was in the summer review. So, Kate, thanks very much for taking the time to come on to the podcast. You have a wide variety of experience in white-collar defense and specifically FCPA, so I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts might be on some of the interesting developments we've had so far in 2015.
Well, Tom, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
One of the things that I think was on everybody's mind, radar, readings, maybe even watching videos was the Joseph Siegelman trial in New York, which concluded in June. And the Department of Justice settled with Mr. Siegelman. He took a guilty plea after a few days, maybe a week or two of trial. And the trial itself was viewed as a loss by the Department of Justice, but Mr. Siegelman did plead guilty to conspiracy to violate the FCPA with two of his other co-executives from Petro Tiger. But I was wondering, as a white-collar practitioner in this space, so kind of what were your thoughts on the Siegelman trial?
Well, it certainly came, I think, as a surprise to see that trial unravel so quickly, and not a welcome blow to the fraud section after some of their high-profile, missteps in SHOT Show cases and in Lindsay. But I think, these cases are hard to prove, and not just FCPA cases, but public corruption cases generally. And, the DOJ, has suffered high-profile losses in domestic corruption cases, Stevens, Edwards, others, but, it doesn't stop them from coming after the next generation. So I think in the FCPA world, the Siegelman trial may in the short term cause the fraud section to be somewhat more selective in what they go to trial and maybe do some closer homework on, where are our potential weak spots once we get into the courtroom. But it's hard to say. I mean, as a practical matter, it's not an option for them to abandon the trial route, right? They have to be able to convict some percentage of the folks that they go after who won't plead, because it's like football, right? You have to be able to run and pass, or the defense only has to worry about one of those things. And I think for white-collar cases, it's the same for DOJ. They have to be able to win. They clearly are running at a lower percentage success rate than DOJ more broadly. White-collar cases nationwide, DOJ's over 90% success rate in their prosecutions. So we're clearly not there, although we have a very small sampling size to work from. So they've got progress that they need to make. There's no question about that. After SHOT Show and Lindsay, they brought in people who have real trial chops. They formalized to a greater degree how they run investigations in anticipation of having to go into trial. I think Siegelman shows maybe they're not quite there yet, but I think they're making progress, and I think they'll just keep coming at individuals. It's too important a piece of their enforcement approach.
One of the things that specifically around the Siegelman indictment and trial was the use of cooperating witnesses, wiretaps, video taps, and other investigative techniques that we've seen previously used against organized crime and other white-collar investigations. Do you see those types of investigative techniques continue to be used by the DOJ and FBI going forward?
Absolutely. And the FBI participation in these efforts really sort of reorganized itself in the last few years, and there's no question that the DOJ has recognized that they have to investigate these cases in the same ways that they do other white-collar cases if they're going to have a better success rate in the prosecution of individuals. So there's no question they're going to use all the tools that are available to them. And I think one of the challenges is it's a bit of a hybrid in FCPA because you still do have so much voluntary disclosure, internal investigation material being generated by the companies. So that's different than you have in a lot of other enforcement areas. But no question they're going to use all the arrows in the quiver that they can.
One of the things that I think is not discussed as much generally around the Siegelman case because of perhaps the high-profile nature of the trial collapse was what happened to the company who self-disclosed Petro Tiger. Mm-hmm. And they received a declination from the Department of Justice in the face of two co-executive CEOs pleading guilty and the general counsel pleading guilty to FCPA violations. Does the declination given to or afforded to Petro Tiger provide any lessons learned for the compliance practitioner?
Well, Petro Tiger, I think, is probably close to the scenario that you would have seen in Morgan Stanley declination in terms of, the company being highly cooperative, really pushing forward with, look, these are the individuals that seem to have run this scheme, taking all the steps that they could to demonstrate that they had several rogues in their midst. I think what's interesting about Petro Tiger is obviously they're, given the seniority in the company of the individuals, typically when you see somewhat of a rogue employee approach, it's a more junior person. So, but I think, Leslie Caldwell and others at DOJ have made a point of saying that if you do all the right things as a company, we are going to look closely at whether a declination is appropriate, and she's been quite vocal on making sure that the numbers back that up. And one of the things you see in our summer review is that the statistics bear that out. They've got 6 DOJ and 3 SEC declinations in the first half of the year, which is numbers that rival the annual numbers of some of the prior years. So they definitely are looking to send a message to companies of levels of cooperation, not just in getting the facts as to the company, but also assisting in the prosecution of individuals is something that is valued and is taken into account in the declination decision.
Ken, if I could turn now to the Securities and Exchange Commission and one of their premier or significant enforcement actions in 2015, which involved BHP Billiton. This was a civil side FCPA investigation and enforcement action and focused on the accounting provisions of the FCPA. Could you discuss that case for us and what lessons the compliance practitioner may draw from that enforcement action?
Sure. So the BHP Billiton case came about after a several-year-long investigation that looked into mining operations as well as the hosting of the Beijing Olympics. The DOJ walked away from the case the SEC stuck around and focused only on this hosting of individual officials at the Beijing Olympics. And what is interesting about the case is that it's a further expansion of the SEC's interpretation of internal accounting controls. And I guess I'd argue it sort of eliminates the word accounting from that phrase in terms of how they view it. Because in BHP Billiton, if you look at the public papers, the case is based on two things. One, the lack of a centralized review of the invitations that were going out to people. So the company's program is decentralized. Generally, they set up a system to vet who could receive an invitation and who could attend, intending to try to weed out folks who had key decisions pending before them, and so that the hosting might be viewed as an improper, influence payment. But what the SEC didn't like was that, in their view, BHP Billiton failed then to really track that through, to provide training to the people in the field who were doing the vetting. And so you had some individual recipients that slipped through the cracks that probably shouldn't have. So there was no allegation that there were inaccurate accounting entries, no allegations that there were inaccurate supporting documentation for those entries. So in terms of books and records, there's not an allegation that the books and records were inaccurate, which is really the core of those provisions. So it really does stray into basic compliance program material. So, the logic that's set out there could equally apply to what's in your third-party due diligence files, how you manage third-party due diligence, how you manage charitable contribution, decision-making, sort of a wide variety of activities that aren't directly related to your spending. So I think companies are rightly concerned about, whether the SEC's view of its mandate has sort of taken over everything that is, within a company's operations. And, there's been in the last couple of years more discussion about this among practitioners and at conferences, and concern about, where are the limits. And I think we'll see more of those conversations coming forward, and, whether, in fact, the SEC may be overreaching in some of these cases.
Kate, I started out asking some pretty specific questions about two pretty public enforcement actions from 2015. Perhaps I should step back and ask a little bit more generally about the FCPA summer review, and indeed the firm's annual and quarterly reviews, what they are, what they try to detail, and then from there, are there any general trends that you noted that were specifically discussed in the summer review?
Sure. So the reviews we put out quarterly, which is really just driven by the fact that there's enough to do and to say when you look at what's happening around the globe in the anti-corruption effort that you can't really meaningfully manage it on a one-off basis, and there's enough volume of activity that it's helpful to sort of look at it from a trend perspective. So what we try to do is each quarter, gather up all of the enforcement actions in the U.S., the enforcement actions elsewhere in the world, agency developments in terms of whether it's, policies, guidance, personnel changes, and the like, and then related areas. So, for example, one trend, if you want to call it that, or at least it's a cluster of activity in the anti-corruption world that has come out in the first 6 months of this year is a cluster of commercial bribery cases. So the FIFA action is a good example of that. Those are not FCPA cases simply because FIFA officers are not foreign officials under the statute, but in all other shapes and sizes, it looks just like an FCPA case. So I think, one thing that's interesting in looking at some of the cases that we saw in the first 6 months is, again, looking at the question of whether you should be evaluating your program to determine, do we need to do more on the commercial bribery side of the shop? And many companies did that after the UKBA, but not all. And, I think that'll be a continuing conversation. So, the SFO brought its first prosecution under the UKBA, which was not a Section 6 case, which is the section in the UKBA that prohibits bribery of foreign public officials. So that was a commercial bribery case. And the Goodyear settlement back in February with the SEC is a mix of public and commercial bribery in those allegations as well. So that's one piece of the puzzle that we saw this year. Another I referenced briefly earlier, which is the increase in declinations, which DOJ previewed in their public comments earlier in the year. And I think declinations is always an interesting topic because there's a question of what's the definition of a declination, and is it a true declination if there's really just not a case to be made? So sometimes we see there are jurisdictional hurdles. Sometimes we may have a burden of proof problem on another element of a violation. So can you call it a declination if really it's just we can't make the case, so we're not going to try, versus cases where there appear to be all of the elements are met and the DOJ could bring the case and they choose not to and exercise the discretion, which to me is a more pure declination scenario.
Right.
And from the public papers, I would say the FLIR case appears to be more in that lineup, fairly egregious, sort of 1970s style gifts, travel, and entertainment. But in that case, the SEC brought enforcement actions against the two individuals involved. FLIR disclosed, cooperated fully with both agencies. And it's possible, it's always, reading the tea leaves, it's possible that DOJ's view was that was a sufficient response and there was no need for additional response directly from the Department of Justice. So those are two of the things. I guess the last piece is that we, in terms of the overall number of announced enforcement actions, 2015's been a slow year. I always hesitate to say that means it's going to be a slow year because we always see a little spike in the fourth quarter. But I think one question is whether we are seeing, this correlation of more declinations, fewer enforcement actions announced. There's always cases in the pipeline, so we'll see what happens as we go forward. But it's just sort of interesting to watch the statistics.
One of the things you note in the report is the SEC issued guidance regarding administrative proceedings. Mm-hmm. And we've had a few SEC enforcement actions that have gone through those administrative proceedings, although those have been essentially settled actions. So there hasn't been a true adversarial proceeding. We have had adversarial proceedings in other contexts that have been vociferously objected to by certain counsel in other white-collar or insider trading cases. Do you have any thoughts on where that debate may be going? Do you see the SEC moving forward aggressively with this or having to pull back a little bit because of even constitutional challenges?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where this heads because, as we note in the review, the defense bar was not very happy with the guidance. I think generally the reaction is it sheds very little light on how the forum decision is made, sort of sets up the SEC to engage in forum shopping. And I think there's a little bit of concern, that the SEC is sort of setting itself up like Roger Goodell. It sort of makes all the decisions, and if it doesn't want to go to a real appeal process, we'll go around ourselves. So it's sort of a question mark of where they're going to go. The third criterion that they list, which is the cost, resource, and time effectiveness of litigation in each forum, is one that drew a lot of criticism, and that's an argument against it is that administrative hearings can progress more quickly than in federal court, but maybe not. It's sort of, who knows? A quick hearing gives the defense, a short amount of time to prepare the case, whereas the SEC typically has been looking at these issues for years. So I think there's a lot of devil in the details issues with this. I think practitioners are concerned about where it's heading, and I do think that we'll see a lot of attention paid to it in the coming months as they try to roll this out more.
One of the areas that many U.S. compliance practitioners have questions about, or maybe even some confusion, is something you touched on, the U.K. Bribery Act. Mm-hmm. And there have been speculation, or if not outright wonder, if the SFO, Serious Fraud Office, is going to move forward more aggressively. Do you have any thoughts, either based upon the public data or other intelligence you've been able to gather on where the SFO might be going into the second half of this year, or maybe even forward into 2016?
I think that's a very muddy crystal ball.
Touché.
It continues to be so. I think, if you look at the discussion around the Tesco matter, to me that just shows there's a pretty high level of chaos in terms of how to press forward. So Tesco was so concerned about not what they say trampling on the SFO's prosecution and investigation that they chose not to interview their employees in person and sent out written interviews, sort of exit interviews, and then on the basis of the responses that the people, provided in writing, decided to terminate them or not. And so now Tesco's facing potential employment litigation for wrongful termination and lack of due process in that effort. And so you can see these companies sort of getting whipsawed. And there was a recent roundtable among various prosecutors, including David Green from the SFO, and private practitioners talking about this. And you can really see the tensions with, the arrival of the deferred prosecution agreement mechanism, on the table for the SFO, laying alongside a tradition and still a prosecutorial sort of structure and approach that assumes that the prosecutor will be doing all of the investigation. And those two things right now are in tension, and it's not clear to me how they're going to resolve them, because, Tesco, the notion from a U.S. practitioner's perspective that you would not interview people who engaged in wrongdoing, I don't know how you remediate a problem if you don't do the homework to figure out what the problem was and how it happened. So it's just, I don't know where we're going to go with that, but I think Tesco in particular has been fascinating in terms of the practical implications for companies of trying to manage this. And when you layer on, per Tesco, they're not under investigation in the U.S., but if you layer on the notion of that kind of tension and whipsawing in a multi-jurisdictional investigation where you're also dealing with U.S. authorities, German authorities, and others, and you have just a real, quilt of different expectations, I think companies really are in quite a difficult position.
Well, Kate, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, and I say unfortunately because I could probably sit and pick your brain for as long as you chose to have it picked. But I was wondering if someone wanted to take a look at the summer report. Could you tell us where they might go to find it, or a copy of it?
Sure. So it's always published on our website, which is www.millerchevalier.com, and you can just go on there, and on the publications page, you will see it. For a while, it'll scroll on the homepage, but you can always find it there. And if you can't find your way to it, you can always just contact one of the lawyers in the practice group.
And I also note on the firm website that your contact information is available. If anyone wanted to follow up on any questions they might have, that information is available as well.
Thanks very much.
Kate, I really appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Likewise. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Hello again, this is Tom Fox. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report, and you'll tune in next week for some additional episodes. I have two calls to action for you. The first is please go to iTunes and rate this podcast. It would certainly help our ratings and standings in iTunes. The second is if you have not subscribed to this podcast or to my blog, the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog, please do so. I think you'll enjoy both. I look forward to visiting with you again. Thank you very much for listening.